Hey there. Tonight we're travelling back not to grand battles or triumphant conquests, but to something quieter, more intimate. The daily art of getting along with people who live just beyond your garden wall. We're talking about how ordinary Romans dealt with their neighbours. Not the senators or emperors you read about in history books, but regular people trying to make life work in cramped apartments, shared courtyards, and narrow streets where everyone could hear everyone else's business. If this kind of calm, slow history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always strangely comforting to see who's out there falling asleep to the same quiet story. So dim the lights, turn on a fan if you like, that soft background hum. Settle in, and let's begin in a place where privacy was a luxury most people couldn't afford. Picture this. You're living in ancient Rome, maybe around 100 AD. The city is alive, bustling, crowded beyond anything we can imagine today. You don't live in a villa with marble columns and sprawling gardens. You're not a patrician with slaves to handle your daily troubles. You're just someone trying to get by, living in what the Romans called an insula, a multi-story apartment building that housed dozens of families, sometimes hundreds of people, all stacked on top of each other like a human hive. Your home isn't much. Maybe 2 rooms if you're lucky, one for sleeping, one for everything else. Cooking, eating, working, arguing, making up. The walls are thin. So thin that you know when your upstairs neighbour Marcus has had too much wine again, because you can hear him stumbling around, knocking things over, muttering to himself about his problems at the bakery where he works. You know when the family below you is having another fight about money, because their voices carry up through the floorboards like they're standing right next to you. You know when the couple next door is reconciling after their argument because, well, some sounds travel better than others, through cheap construction. This is your world, intimate, crowded, unavoidable. There's no escaping to a suburban house with a white picket fence. No retreating to your private sanctuary. Your neighbours aren't just people you wave to occasionally. They're part of your daily existence, whether you like it or not. And somehow, despite the chaos, despite the noise, despite the complete lack of personal space, Romans figured out how to make it work. They had to, because when you're living this close to other people, when your survival depends on the community around you, you learn the delicate art of coexistence. You develop unspoken rules, quiet understandings, small rituals that keep the peace. Let's start with the morning. You wake up not to an alarm clock, but to the sounds of your building coming alive. The baker on the ground floor starts his ovens before dawn. The rhythmic thumping of dough being kneaded becomes your natural wake-up call. You don't complain about the noise, you're grateful for it. Fresh bread means you don't have to walk 6 blocks to find breakfast, and the warmth from his ovens helps heat the whole building during the cold months. Your neighbour Gaius, who works at the docks, leaves for work while it's still dark. His heavy boots on the wooden stairs used to annoy you, but now you've learned to appreciate the sound. It means he's employed, which means he can pay his rent, which means you won't have to deal with the chaos of him being evicted and some unknown family moving in next door. The woman across the hall, Claudia, has 3 small children. In any modern apartment building, this would be a nightmare, but here, it's just life. The children play in the courtyard during the day, and their laughter echoes up through the building. Sometimes they're loud, sometimes they cry, but they're also your early warning system. When they suddenly go quiet and run inside, you know there's trouble on the street. Maybe a fight brewing, maybe soldiers passing through, maybe just a particularly aggressive merchant who's had too much to drink. See, Romans understood something we've forgotten in our age of privacy and personal space. They knew that your neighbours weren't just random people who happened to live nearby. They were your safety net, your information network, your entertainment, and sometimes your lifeline. When you got sick, it wasn't a doctor who took care of you. It was Claudia from across the hall, who knew which herbs to boil and how to bring down a fever. When you needed to borrow olive oil for cooking, you didn't go to a store. You knocked on Marcus's door upstairs and he'd share what he had, knowing you'd do the same for him next week. When strangers came to the building asking questions, everyone suddenly became deaf and blind. Not because they were unfriendly, but because they understood that protecting each other meant protecting themselves. The authorities could be just as dangerous as criminals, and sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. This wasn't charity. This was survival. Romans called it clientela, though that word usually described the formal relationships between powerful patrons and their dependents. But the same principle worked on a smaller scale in these crowded buildings. You created networks of mutual obligation, tiny webs of favor and debt that held communities together. You helped your neighbors not out of the goodness of your heart, but because you knew that someday you'd need their help too. When your job at the pottery shop ended because business was slow, it was your neighbor who mentioned that his cousin needed someone to help with deliveries. When your roof started leaking during the rainy season, it was the family downstairs who let you sleep on their floor until you could get it fixed. But this closeness came with rules, unspoken, but absolutely essential rules that everyone understood. You didn't ask too many questions about where your neighbor got that nice new cloak, especially if he'd been out of work for a month. You didn't comment on the fact that the woman next door seemed to have a lot of male visitors during the day, while her husband was at work. You didn't mention that you'd seen someone sneaking food from the communal storage area during the night. Privacy wasn't about having your own space. It was about knowing when to look away, when to keep your mouth shut, when to pretend you hadn't seen or heard something that might cause trouble for someone else. The Romans had a phrase for this: auribus teneo lupum. I hold a wolf by the ears, meaning that sometimes you're in a situation where you can't let go, but you also can't hold on safely. Living in close quarters with your neighbors was like this. You couldn't escape them, but you also couldn't control them. So you learned to navigate carefully, to find the balance between involvement and distance. Take the issue of noise. In a modern apartment, you might call the police if your neighbor's music is too loud. But in ancient Rome, there were no noise ordinances, no police to call, no landlord to complain to. You handled it yourself, and you handled it diplomatically. If the family upstairs was being too loud, you didn't pound on the ceiling or storm up there demanding silence. You waited for a natural opportunity to mention it. Maybe you'd run into them at the public fountain, where everyone went to get water, and you'd casually mention that you'd been having trouble sleeping lately. Not accusing, just sharing information. Most people would get the hint and try to keep it down. If they didn't get the hint, you might try a different approach. You'd mention to another neighbor that you'd been having trouble sleeping, loud enough that the offending family might overhear. Social pressure was often more effective than direct confrontation. Nobody wanted to be known as the inconsiderate neighbor who kept everyone awake. And if that didn't work, you'd escalate carefully. Maybe you'd have a friend mention something to them, or you'd find a way to make your own noise at a time when it would particularly bother them. Not out of spite, but to help them understand how their actions affected others. The key was never to make it personal, never to attack someone's character or make them lose face in front of the community. Because once you did that, you'd created an enemy instead of just solving a problem. And in a place where you had to live with these people day after day, year after year, making enemies was a luxury you couldn't afford. This same principle applied to everything. When someone borrowed something and didn't return it, you didn't accuse them of theft. You'd mention in casual conversation that you were looking for that item, giving them a chance to remember and return it without embarrassment. When someone's children were causing problems, you didn't criticize their parenting. You'd find a way to help solve the problem while allowing them to maintain their dignity. The Romans understood that shame was a powerful force, but it had to be used carefully. A little bit of social pressure could encourage good behavior, but too much would create resentment and conflict. They walked this line every day, in dozens of small interactions, keeping their communities functioning through a delicate balance of involvement and restraint. Water was always an issue. Most buildings didn't have running water, so everyone had to collect it from public fountains. This meant waiting in line, often for a long time, especially during the busy morning hours. You'd think this would create conflict, but Romans turned it into an opportunity for community building. The fountain became the neighborhood news center. While you waited for your turn, you'd catch up on gossip, share information about job opportunities, discuss the latest political developments, complain about the weather. Children would play while their mothers chatted. Young people would flirt while pretending to be interested in the water quality. But even here, there were rules. You didn't cut in line, no matter how urgent your need. You didn't take more than your fair share, even if the fountain was flowing well that day. You didn't monopolize the conversation or spread malicious rumors. You helped elderly neighbors carry their heavy water jugs, and you kept an eye on everyone's children while they played. When someone broke these unspoken rules, the community would respond, not with violence or formal punishment, but with subtle social corrections. Maybe people would stop including the offender in conversations. Maybe they'd be a little less helpful when that person needed assistance. Maybe they'd find themselves at the back of the line more often than seemed like coincidence. This wasn't cruelty, it was education. The community was teaching its members how to behave in a way that benefited everyone. Most people learned quickly and adjusted their behavior. Those who didn't found themselves increasingly isolated, which in a world where isolation meant vulnerability, was a powerful incentive to change. Fire was another constant concern. In buildings made mostly of wood, with cooking fires and oil lamps in every apartment, the risk of fire was always present. One careless moment, one overturned lamp, one spark that landed in the wrong place, and the entire building could go up in flames in minutes. So, neighbors watched out for each other. You'd notice if smoke was coming from an apartment when no one should be cooking. You'd check on elderly neighbors who might forget to extinguish their lamps properly. You'd help maintain the building's few firefighting tools, simple buckets and blankets that everyone hoped they'd never need to use. When a fire did start, everyone responded immediately. Not just the people in the threatened building, but neighbors from surrounding buildings too. They'd form bucket brigades, help evacuate people and possessions, offer temporary shelter to those who lost their homes. Because everyone understood that fire was a community problem, not an individual one. The response to fire revealed something essential about Roman neighborhood life. In a crisis, all the small tensions and minor grievances disappeared. The person you'd been annoyed with for letting their children play too loudly became someone whose life you'd risk your own to save. The neighbor who'd borrowed your cooking pot and forgotten to return it became someone you'd help carry to safety. This wasn't unique to Romans. It's human nature to come together in emergencies. But Romans built their daily social systems around this truth. They understood that the same people who might annoy you in normal times were the ones who'd save your life in extraordinary times. So they structured their communities to strengthen those bonds, to create networks of mutual dependence that could handle both daily irritations and life-threatening crises. The marketplace was where all these social skills were put to their ultimate test. Unlike the controlled environment of your apartment building, where you knew everyone and had established relationships, the market threw you into contact with strangers, foreigners, and people from different social classes. Here, the art of getting along became more complex, more nuanced. Your typical Roman market wasn't like a modern supermarket where you grab what you need and leave. It was a social battlefield disguised as a shopping trip. Every transaction was a negotiation. Every purchase was a relationship. Every vendor was someone you might need to deal with again next week or next month. Take Quintus, the vegetable seller. He's been working the same corner for 15 years, and he knows every regular customer by name. When you approach his stall, he doesn't just sell you turnips. He asks about your family, remembers that your daughter was sick last month, inquires about your work. This isn't just friendliness, it's business strategy disguised as neighborliness. Because Quintus knows that if he treats you well, if he remembers your preferences, if he saves the good produce for his regular customers, you'll keep coming back. And more importantly, you'll recommend him to your neighbors. Word of mouth was everything in a world without advertising, without reviews, without any way to reach customers except through personal relationships. But this relationship had to be carefully managed. You couldn't be too familiar with Quintus because that would make it harder to negotiate prices. You couldn't be too distant because then he might save the best vegetables for other customers. You had to find that perfect middle ground where you were friendly enough to be remembered, but not so friendly that you couldn't drive a hard bargain. The negotiation itself was an art form. You didn't just ask for the lowest price. That would be insulting to Quintus and would mark you as someone who didn't understand how the game was played. Instead, you'd examine the vegetables carefully, maybe comment on their quality, perhaps mention that you'd seen similar produce at another stall for a different price. All of this was done with a smile, with respect, with the understanding that both of you were playing roles in a familiar dance. Quintus would respond by highlighting the superior quality of his vegetables, maybe mentioning how much work it took to bring them to market, possibly offering to throw in a few extra items if you bought enough. The final price would be somewhere between his opening offer and your initial counteroffer, but the exact amount would depend on dozens of factors. How long you'd been a customer, how much you were buying, what kind of mood he was in, whether he needed to move his inventory quickly. This same pattern repeated with every vendor. The bread seller, the cloth merchant, the man who sold oil and wine. Each relationship had its own rhythm, its own unspoken rules, its own delicate balance of familiarity and formality. And then there were the strangers, merchants from other cities, farmers bringing produce from the countryside, craftsmen you'd never seen before. With these people, you had to be even more careful. You didn't know their reputations, didn't know if they were honest, didn't know if you'd ever see them again. Romans had developed subtle ways of evaluating strangers. They'd watch how the person treated other customers, listen to how they spoke, observe their body language. They'd ask casual questions about where the person was from, what brought them to Rome, how long they'd been selling their particular goods. All of this was done conversationally, as if you were just making friendly small talk, but you were actually gathering intelligence. Other customers would help with this evaluation. If you saw someone you recognized buying from an unfamiliar vendor, that was a good sign. If you noticed that other customers seemed to be avoiding a particular stall, that was a warning. The market had its own informal information network, and smart shoppers learned to tap into it. But even with strangers, Romans tried to create connections. They'd mention mutual acquaintances, reference shared experiences, look for common ground, because they understood that every stranger was a potential neighbor. Every new merchant was someone who might become a regular part of their lives. The same principles that governed apartment building life applied in the marketplace, but with modifications. You still avoided direct confrontation, still tried to help others save face, still worked to maintain social harmony, but you also had to protect yourself from cheaters, from people selling inferior goods, from merchants who might take advantage of your politeness. So Romans developed what we might call defensive neighborliness. They were friendly and helpful, but they also paid attention. They remembered who could be trusted and who couldn't. They shared information about dishonest vendors, warned their neighbors about bad deals, helped each other navigate the complex social landscape of the marketplace. Children learned these skills by watching their parents, by being brought to the market from an early age, by gradually taking on more responsibility for family purchases. By the time they were adults, they could read the social cues, understand the unspoken rules, navigate the relationships that made commerce possible. This wasn't just about buying and selling. It was about maintaining the social fabric that held Roman society together. Every interaction in the marketplace was a small thread in a vast web of relationships that connected families, neighborhoods, and communities across the city. The evening brought different challenges. After a long day of work, of navigating social relationships, of managing the constant pressure of living in close quarters with your neighbors, you might think Romans would retreat to their apartments and shut out the world. But privacy wasn't really an option when your walls were thin and your neighbors were close. Instead, Romans found ways to create social time that felt relaxing rather than stressful. They'd gather in the courtyard of their building, sharing wine and simple food, talking about their day, playing games, telling stories. These weren't formal parties. They were just neighbors being neighbors, finding ways to unwind together. The children would play while the adults talked. Not structured games with rules and equipment, but the timeless games that children create wherever they have space and imagination. They'd chase each other around the courtyard, play hide and seek in the building's nooks and crannies, invent contests and competitions that adults only half understood. The women would often work while they socialized, spinning thread, mending clothes, preparing food for the next day. Their hands stayed busy, but their minds could relax. Their social needs could be met. They'd share advice about household management, gossip about neighbors, discuss the challenges of raising children in such close quarters. The men would talk about work, about politics, about the state of the city, but not in the intense, competitive way they might discuss these topics in more formal settings. This was casual conversation, the kind that let them process their day, share their frustrations, get advice from people who understood their situation. And gradually, as the evening wore on, people would drift back to their apartments. Not all at once, but slowly, naturally. The children would get tired and cranky. The adults would remember tasks that needed to be done before bed. The conversations would wind down, the courtyard would empty, and the building would settle into its nighttime rhythm. But even then, the sense of community didn't disappear. You'd hear your neighbors moving around in their apartments, getting ready for bed, settling down for the night. These sounds weren't intrusions. They were reassurances. They meant that life was continuing normally, that everyone was safe, that the small world of your building was functioning as it should. If someone was sick, you'd hear different sounds, maybe coughing that went on too long, maybe the restless movements of someone who couldn't sleep, maybe the worried voices of family members. And without being asked, neighbors would respond. Someone would bring herbal remedies. Someone else would offer to help with daily tasks. Someone would sit with the sick person so their family could rest. This wasn't formal healthcare. It was community care, the kind that happened naturally when people lived close enough to notice each other's troubles and cared enough to help. It didn't always work. Sometimes people died despite their neighbors' best efforts. But it meant that no one faced illness alone, that everyone had someone watching out for them. Death, when it came, was also a community event. The whole building would help with the funeral arrangements, would contribute what they could to the costs, would support the grieving family. Not because they were required to, but because they understood that someday they might need the same support. And after the funeral, life would continue. New people would move into the empty apartment. New relationships would form. New patterns of daily interaction would develop. The community would adapt, would find ways to incorporate the newcomers into its social fabric, would continue the endless work of living together peacefully. This was the real achievement of Roman neighborhood life. Not the grand architecture or the famous conquests, but the simple fact that millions of people found ways to live together in crowded, chaotic, often difficult conditions without everything falling apart. They created systems of mutual support, unspoken rules of behavior, and social networks that could handle both daily irritations and major crises. They understood that getting along with your neighbors wasn't just about being polite. It was about survival. In a world without modern safety nets, without government services, without the kind of institutional support we take for granted, your neighbours were your insurance policy, your emergency services, your social security system. So they invested in those relationships. They put time and effort into maintaining them. They forgave small offences, helped with big problems, and found ways to balance individual needs with community harmony. They created a system that worked not because it was perfect, but because it was human. The streets themselves became extensions of this neighbourly system. Romans didn't just live in their buildings. They lived on their streets, in their neighbourhoods, as part of communities that extended far beyond their immediate housing. The boundaries between public and private space were fluid, permeable, constantly negotiated. During the day, the streets were full of activity, merchants hawking their wares, children playing, people hurrying to work, neighbours stopping to chat. But this wasn't chaos. It was organised chaos, governed by the same unspoken rules that kept apartment buildings functioning. People knew which parts of the street were for walking, which were for conducting business, which were for socialising. They knew how to navigate crowds without causing conflict, how to conduct transactions without blocking traffic, how to let their children play without creating problems for others. The street vendors became part of the neighbourhood's social fabric. Not just the established merchants with permanent stalls, but the people who set up temporary shops, who sold prepared food, who offered services like knife sharpening or clothes mending. These weren't strangers passing through. They were part of the community's daily rhythm. Your neighbourhood barber didn't just cut hair. He was a source of information, a place where men gathered to discuss the day's events, a social hub where relationships were maintained and new ones formed. The woman who sold prepared food wasn't just providing a service. She was helping working families manage their daily lives, offering a place where people could grab a quick meal and catch up on neighbourhood news. Even the public toilets became social spaces. I know this sounds strange to modern ears, but Romans had a very different relationship with privacy than we do. The public latrines were places where people gathered, where conversations happened, where business was conducted. They were part of the neighbourhood's social infrastructure. This integration of public and private life meant that your reputation extended far beyond your apartment building. The way you behaved on the street, in the market, at the public baths, all of this fed back into your standing in the community. You couldn't be one person at home and a different person in public, because there was no clear boundary between the two. This accountability system worked both ways. It protected you from strangers who might try to take advantage, but it also meant you had to be constantly aware of how your actions affected others. The woman who sold bread on your corner would remember if you were rude to her, and she'd share that information with other vendors. The man who ran the public bath would notice if you were inconsiderate to other customers, and word would spread. But Romans found ways to make this system work for them rather than against them. They understood that reputation was currency, something you earned through consistent behavior and spent carefully when you needed favors. A good reputation meant better prices at the market, help during emergencies, and inclusion in the informal networks that made city life bearable. The concept of honor played a huge role in how neighbors treated each other. Not the grand, heroic honor of warriors and senators, but the quiet, daily honor of keeping your word, helping when you could, and not causing unnecessary trouble for others. This honor wasn't about dramatic gestures. It was about reliability, about being the kind of person others could count on. When Marcus upstairs promised to help you move some furniture, he kept that promise even if it was inconvenient. When Claudia said she'd watch your children while you went to the market, she was there when you needed her. When you borrowed oil from your neighbor, you returned it promptly and maybe added a little extra as a thank you. These small acts of reliability built trust, and trust was what held neighborhoods together. The Romans had a saying, "Fidus facit fidem." Trust creates trust. They understood that every interaction was an opportunity to either strengthen or weaken the bonds that connected them to their neighbors. So they chose their actions carefully, always thinking about how their behavior would affect the delicate web of relationships that surrounded them. Religion played a part in this too, though not in the way you might expect. Romans were deeply religious, but their religion was practical, focused on maintaining good relationships with the gods who controlled their daily lives. Just as they worked to keep their human neighbors happy, they worked to keep their divine neighbors satisfied. Each neighborhood had its own small shrines, its own local gods, its own religious observances. These weren't grand temples with elaborate ceremonies. They were simple affairs, small statues tucked into street corners, offerings left at crossroads, prayers whispered during daily tasks. The local gods were like local neighbors, entities you needed to stay on good terms with if you wanted your life to go smoothly. The festivals and religious observances gave neighbors excuses to come together, to share food and drink, to celebrate as a community. During the Saturnalia in December, normal social rules were temporarily suspended. Masters served their slaves, children could speak freely to adults, and everyone could indulge in behavior that would normally be frowned upon. It was a pressure valve that let the community blow off steam without permanently damaging relationships. But even during these celebrations, there were boundaries. You could be more familiar with your neighbors than usual, but you still had to live with them after the festival ended. You could drink more than normal, but you couldn't do anything that would create lasting resentment. The temporary suspension of rules actually required more social skill, not less. The changing seasons brought different challenges and opportunities for neighborhood life. Summer meant more time spent outdoors, more opportunities for socializing, but also more potential for conflict as people got on each other's nerves in the heat. The courtyards and streets would fill with people trying to escape their stuffy apartments, creating a constant buzz of activity. During the hottest days, normal routines would adjust. People would wake earlier to get their shopping done before the sun became unbearable. They'd take longer midday rests, waiting for the afternoon heat to pass. They'd stay up later, enjoying the cooler evening air. These adjustments had to be negotiated collectively, with everyone's needs taken into account. The public fountains became gathering places where people would linger, not just collecting water, but cooling off, socializing, letting their children play in the spray. These weren't just functional spaces. They were community centers where relationships were maintained and new ones formed. Winter brought different challenges. The cold drove people indoors, but it also created opportunities for different kinds of community building. Neighbors would share fuel for heating, would take turns maintaining common areas, would find ways to help each other through the difficult months. The apartment buildings weren't well insulated, so staying warm required cooperation. People would gather in the apartments that had the best heating, sharing body warmth and companionship. They'd pool resources to buy fuel, would take turns keeping fires burning through the night, would share warm food and drink. These seasonal rhythms created a natural calendar of community life. People knew when to expect certain behaviors, when to offer certain kinds of help, when to be more or less tolerant of their neighbors' quirks. The predictability of these patterns made it easier to maintain relationships over time. Spring brought renewal, not just of the natural world, but of community bonds. After months of being cooped up together, people would emerge from their apartments ready to reconnect with their neighbors. The courtyards would fill with activity as people cleaned, repaired, and prepared for the year ahead. This was when new neighbors were most likely to be welcomed into the community. The general spirit of renewal made people more open to change, more willing to give strangers a chance, more optimistic about the possibilities for new relationships. The Roman legal system, such as it was for ordinary people, couldn't handle every dispute that arose between neighbors. Most conflicts had to be resolved through negotiation, mediation, and social pressure. This meant that communities developed their own informal justice systems, their own ways of determining what was fair and enforcing their decisions. When disputes arose, they were usually handled by respected members of the community, not necessarily the oldest or the wealthiest, but the people who had proven themselves to be fair, wise, and trustworthy. These informal mediators would listen to both sides, consult with other neighbors, and try to find solutions that everyone could live with. The goal wasn't to determine who was right and who was wrong. It was to restore harmony to the community, to find ways for people to continue living together peacefully. This often meant compromises that no one was completely happy with, but that everyone could accept. For example, if two neighbors were arguing about noise, the mediator might suggest specific quiet hours, or ways to muffle sound, or alternative spaces for loud activities. The solution would be tailored to the specific situation, taking into account the needs of both parties and the impact on the broader community. Enforcement of these informal agreements relied on social pressure. If someone violated a community decision, they might find themselves excluded from social gatherings, ignored at the market, or simply treated with cool politeness until they changed their behavior. This wasn't cruelty. It was a way of maintaining standards without resorting to violence or formal legal proceedings. The threat of social exclusion was powerful because Romans understood that isolation was dangerous. In a world where your neighbors were your safety net, being cut off from the community was a serious consequence. Most people would rather compromise than face that kind of isolation. But the system also had built-in forgiveness mechanisms. People who changed their behavior, who showed genuine remorse for their actions, who made efforts to repair relationships, could usually find their way back into the community's good graces. Romans understood that holding grudges forever was destructive to everyone involved. This informal justice system worked because it was based on relationships rather than rules. People knew each other, understood each other's circumstances, and were invested in finding solutions that would work for everyone. It was flexible enough to handle the complexity of human behavior, but strong enough to maintain community standards. The economic relationships between neighbors were just as important as the social ones. In a world where formal banking was limited and credit was personal, your neighbors were often your financial partners. You might borrow money from the baker downstairs, invest in a merchant's trading venture, or pool resources with other families to buy expensive items. These economic relationships had to be carefully managed. Money could strengthen bonds between neighbors, but it could also destroy them if things went wrong. Romans developed elaborate systems of informal credit, mutual investment, and shared resources that allowed communities to function economically while minimizing conflict. When you borrowed money from a neighbor, you weren't just entering into a financial transaction. You were creating a relationship that would affect how you interacted with that person for years to come. The terms of the loan, the repayment schedule, the consequences of default, all of these had to be negotiated in ways that preserved the social fabric of the community. Similarly, when neighbors went into business together, they had to find ways to share profits and losses fairly while maintaining their personal relationships. A failed business venture could destroy not just the financial investment, but the trust and friendship that had made the partnership possible in the first place. Romans developed sophisticated ways of managing these risks. They would involve other neighbors as witnesses to important agreements, would structure deals to minimize the potential for conflict, would build in mechanisms for resolving disputes before they became destructive. They understood that preserving relationships was often more important than maximizing profits. The workshops and small businesses that operated out of apartment buildings created another layer of economic interdependence. The shoemaker on the first floor depended on his neighbors not just as customers, but as sources of materials, as references for new customers, as partners in various business ventures. These businesses weren't separate from the community. They were integral parts of it, embedded in the social networks that connected neighbors to each other. Success in business depended as much on maintaining good relationships as on producing quality goods or services. The children growing up in these neighborhoods learned these lessons through observation and participation. They saw how their parents navigated complex social and economic relationships, how they balanced individual needs with community harmony, how they built and maintained the networks that made their lives possible. By the time they were adults, they understood intuitively how to read social cues, how to negotiate conflicts, how to build trust, how to contribute to community life. These weren't skills that were formally taught. They were absorbed through daily experience, through watching how successful adults managed their relationships with neighbors. This informal education system was remarkably effective. Generation after generation of Romans learned to live together in crowded, challenging conditions without everything falling apart. They developed social skills that allowed them to create order out of chaos, to find cooperation in competition, to build communities that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character. The legacy of Roman neighborhood life isn't found in the grand monuments or the famous battles. It's found in the simple fact that millions of ordinary people found ways to live together peacefully, to support each other through difficult times, to create communities that worked. They showed that getting along with your neighbors isn't just about being polite. It's about building the relationships that make civilization possible. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about those Roman neighbors. Think about Marcus stumbling home from the bakery, about Claudia managing her 3 children in a 2-room apartment, about Quintus selling vegetables in the market while building relationships that would last for years. Think about the quiet heroism of ordinary people who chose cooperation over conflict, who built communities one small interaction at a time. Their voices have been silent for centuries, but their example remains. In a world where we often feel disconnected from our neighbors, where privacy has become more important than community, where we've forgotten the art of living together, the Romans remind us that there's another way, that neighbors aren't just people who happen to live nearby. They're the people who make our lives possible, who share our burdens, who help us through the long, difficult, beautiful work of being human. The apartment buildings of ancient Rome are gone, crumbled into dust and memory, but the lessons they taught about getting along with neighbors, about building communities, about finding ways to live together peacefully, these lessons endure. They whisper to us across the centuries, reminding us that the most important history isn't written in books. It's written in the daily choices we make about how to treat the people who share our world. So tomorrow, when you see your neighbors, remember the Romans. Remember that every interaction is an opportunity to build trust, that every kindness creates a stronger community, that the art of getting along with neighbors is really the art of being human. Remember that in a world full of strangers, your neighbors are the people who can help you find your way home. And as the seasons turned and years passed, Romans developed something we might call the wisdom of small spaces. They learned that survival in crowded conditions wasn't just about tolerating each other. It was about creating invisible boundaries, unspoken territories, and gentle rhythms that allowed dozens of people to share what we might consider impossible living conditions. Take the simple act of hanging laundry. In a modern apartment, you might have a washer and dryer tucked away in a closet, but Romans washed their clothes in communal areas, then hung them to dry wherever they could find space. This created a complex choreography of timing and territory that had to be negotiated daily. Claudia, the woman with 3 children, had learned to do her washing early in the morning, before the courtyard filled with people. She'd claim the best spots for hanging clothes, the places where the sun would hit first and the breeze would dry things fastest. But she also made sure to leave room for her neighbors, understanding that hogging all the good drying space would create resentment that could last for months. Marcus, who worked at the bakery and came home covered in flour, needed to wash his work clothes every day. but he'd learned to time his washing so it didn't interfere with the women who had larger families and needed more space. He'd hang his few items in the less desirable spots, the shadier corners where clothes took longer to dry, because he understood that his convenience wasn't more important than the community's harmony. The children learned to navigate around the hanging clothes without touching them, without playing games that might knock them down, without creating the kind of chaos that would make their mothers' lives more difficult. They developed an almost supernatural ability to run and play in spaces that seemed too small and too crowded for any kind of movement. This wasn't just about laundry. It was about understanding that in a world where space was limited, every square foot had to be negotiated, shared, and respected. The same principles applied to cooking, to storing belongings, to finding quiet spaces for rest or conversation. The evening meal became a particularly delicate dance. Most families cooked in their apartments, but the smells would drift through the thin walls, creating a kind of olfactory neighborhood map. You'd know when the family upstairs was having a good week because you could smell meat cooking. You'd know when times were tough because the smell of thin gruel would hang in the air. These smells weren't just information, they were invitations and sometimes sources of tension. When one family was cooking something particularly delicious, others might feel envious, especially if they were struggling financially. But Romans learned to handle even this with grace. If you were having a better meal than usual, you might make a little extra and share it with a neighbor who was struggling. Not as charity, which would have been insulting, but as a gesture of friendship. You'd knock on their door and mention that you'd cooked too much, that you didn't want it to go to waste, that you'd appreciate their help finishing it. The recipient would accept graciously, understanding that this was how communities took care of each other. They'd remember the kindness and return it when they could, perhaps not with food, but with some other favor, some other service that would help balance the scales of mutual obligation. Children were particularly skilled at this kind of food diplomacy. They'd appear at neighbors' doors with small offerings from their family's meal, their wide eyes and innocent smiles making it impossible to refuse. They'd return home with treats from other families, creating a kind of informal food distribution network that helped ensure no one went hungry when others had plenty. The Romans called this pietas, though that word meant much more than simple charity. It meant understanding your obligations to others, recognizing that your well-being was connected to the well-being of your community, acting in ways that strengthened rather than weakened the bonds that held everyone together. This principle extended beyond food to every aspect of daily life. When someone was sick, neighbors would quietly take over their daily tasks without being asked. When someone was struggling with work, others would share information about opportunities, make introductions, offer advice. When someone was celebrating, the whole community would find ways to participate in the joy. But this closeness also meant that personal problems became community problems. When a couple was fighting, everyone knew about it. When someone was drinking too much, it affected the whole building. When children were misbehaving, it reflected on their parents' reputation and their families' standing in the community. Romans developed sophisticated ways of addressing these problems without destroying relationships. They understood that direct confrontation often made things worse, so they learned to work around problems, to address issues indirectly, to find solutions that allowed everyone to save face. If someone was drinking too much, neighbors wouldn't stage an intervention. Instead, they'd find ways to keep the person busy, to include them in activities that didn't involve alcohol, to gradually redirect their behavior without making them feel attacked or judged. If a couple was fighting too much, neighbors would create opportunities for them to spend time apart, would offer to watch their children, would invite them to participate in activities that might help them remember why they liked each other in the first place. If children were causing problems, neighbors would find ways to redirect their energy, to give them jobs or responsibilities that made them feel important while keeping them out of trouble. They understood that children who felt valued by the community were less likely to cause problems for the community. This indirect approach required patience, subtlety, and a deep understanding of human nature. Romans became experts at reading between the lines, at understanding what people really needed, even when they couldn't ask for it directly, at finding ways to help without making others feel dependent or grateful. The public baths were where many of these social skills were put to their ultimate test. Unlike the controlled environment of your apartment building, the baths brought together people from different neighborhoods, different social classes, different backgrounds. Here, the art of getting along became even more complex. The baths weren't just places to get clean. They were social clubs, business centers, gossip networks, and political forums all rolled into one. Romans would spend hours there, not just bathing, but socializing, exercising, conducting business, and maintaining the relationships that made their lives possible. But the baths also had strict, unspoken rules about behavior. You couldn't be too familiar with strangers, but you couldn't be unfriendly either. You had to respect the space and time of others, but you also had to be open to conversation and connection. You had to maintain your dignity while being literally naked and vulnerable. The process of bathing itself required cooperation. The hot rooms were crowded, the pools were shared, and the attendants were few. Romans learned to take turns, to help each other with hard-to-reach places, to share the limited space and resources graciously. They developed elaborate etiquette around these shared experiences. How to enter a crowded pool without disturbing others. How to leave without creating waves. How to use the limited seating without hogging the best spots. How to conduct business conversations without boring or excluding others. How to share gossip without spreading malicious rumors. The baths were also where Romans learned about people from other parts of the city, other social classes, other backgrounds. A successful merchant might find himself sharing a pool with a struggling artisan. A senator's son might end up in conversation with a former slave. These interactions required even more delicate social navigation. Romans learned to find common ground without highlighting differences, to show respect for others' circumstances without being condescending, to maintain their own dignity without putting others down. They understood that the baths were neutral territory where normal social hierarchies were temporarily suspended, but they also knew that what happened there would affect their reputations in the broader community. The attendants at the baths became skilled at managing these complex social dynamics. They knew how to seat people in ways that would minimize conflict, how to time services so that rivals wouldn't encounter each other, how to handle disputes without causing scenes that would disturb other patrons. They also served as informal mediators, helping to resolve conflicts that might arise, providing neutral ground for difficult conversations, offering advice to people who were struggling with social problems. The best attendants were like social workers, therapists, and diplomats all rolled into one. The massage rooms were where some of the most delicate social negotiations took place. Here, Romans would relax their guard, would share confidences, would reveal vulnerabilities that they kept hidden in other contexts. The masseurs learned to listen without judging, to keep secrets, to provide not just physical relief but emotional support. These conversations often led to new business relationships, new friendships, new solutions to problems that had seemed intractable. The combination of physical relaxation and social connection created an atmosphere where people could be more open, more creative, more willing to find common ground. But the masseurs also had to be careful not to become too involved in their clients' problems, not to take sides in disputes, not to violate the trust that people placed in them. They walked a careful line between being helpful and being neutral, between being friendly and being professional. The exercise areas of the baths were where Romans learned different kinds of social skills. Here, competition was open and direct, but it had to be managed carefully to avoid creating lasting resentments. Romans developed elaborate rules for fair play, for gracious winning and losing, for maintaining friendships, even in the context of competition. They understood that physical contests were also social contests, that how you behaved in competition revealed your character, that reputation for fairness and good sportsmanship was more valuable than any individual victory. The best athletes were those who could compete fiercely while maintaining their relationships with their opponents. The games themselves became metaphors for larger social dynamics. Learning to compete without destroying relationships, to win without humiliating others, to lose without losing face. These skills translated directly to success in business, politics, and community life. The changing rooms were where Romans learned about class differences, about the markers of status and success, about the complex hierarchies that governed their society. Here, you could see who had expensive clothes, who had slaves to help them dress, who had the leisure time to spend hours at the baths. But Romans also learned to navigate these differences gracefully, to show respect for others, regardless of their circumstances, to find ways to connect across class lines. They understood that everyone needed the same basic things, that everyone deserved dignity and respect, that common humanity was more important than social status. The conversations in the changing rooms were often where real business was conducted, where political alliances were formed, where social problems were solved. The informal atmosphere made it easier to have difficult conversations, to float new ideas, to test potential solutions before committing to them publicly. Romans learned to use these conversations strategically, to build coalitions, to gather information, to influence opinion. But they also learned to do this in ways that didn't feel manipulative or calculating, that maintained the fiction that they were just having friendly conversations between equals. The evening departure from the baths was a ritual in itself. Romans would leave feeling refreshed, relaxed, and reconnected with their community. They'd walk home through the darkening streets, often in small groups, continuing conversations that had begun in the baths, making plans for future meetings, strengthening the bonds that held their neighborhoods together. This daily rhythm of separation and reconnection was essential to Roman community life. People needed time apart to pursue their individual interests and responsibilities, but they also needed regular opportunities to come together, to share experiences, to remember that they were part of something larger than themselves. The streets at night became different kinds of social spaces. During the day, they were busy with commerce and work, but in the evening, they became places for leisure, for conversation, for the quieter kinds of social interaction that built deeper relationships. Romans would linger outside their apartment buildings, enjoying the cooler air, watching their children play, talking with neighbors about the day's events. These weren't formal gatherings. They were just people being people, finding natural ways to connect with others, to share their lives, to build the relationships that made their communities work. The night watchmen became part of this social fabric. They weren't just security guards. They were neighbors who happened to work at night, who knew everyone in the area, who served as informal mediators, information sources, and emergency responders. They walked the streets not just to prevent crime, but to maintain the social connections that prevented crime by making everyone feel responsible for everyone else's safety. When problems arose at night, the watchmen would handle them in ways that preserved community harmony. If someone was drunk and causing problems, they'd help them get home safely rather than arresting them. If neighbors were fighting, they'd mediate rather than taking sides. If strangers were causing trouble, they'd encourage them to move along rather than creating confrontations. This approach worked because it was based on relationships rather than rules. The watchmen knew everyone in their area, understood the social dynamics, could predict how different people would react to different approaches. They were part of the community, not separate from it, and their authority came from trust rather than fear. The early morning hours brought their own social rhythms. Romans woke early, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Work started with the dawn, and there was no artificial lighting to extend the day. So the morning became a time for quiet preparation, for gathering energy for the day ahead, for the small rituals that help people transition from private sleep to public life. The first sounds of the day weren't alarm clocks, but the sounds of the community waking up, the baker starting his ovens, the water carrier beginning his rounds, the early workers heading to their jobs. These sounds weren't intrusions. They were reassurances that life was continuing normally, that the community was functioning as it should. Romans learned to wake up gradually, to ease into the day rather than jumping into it. They'd lie in bed for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of their neighbors, preparing mentally for the social interactions they'd have to navigate, reminding themselves of the relationships they needed to maintain. The morning rituals of dressing, eating, and preparing for work became opportunities for family bonding, for planning the day's activities, for reviewing the previous day's social interactions. Romans understood that success in their complicated social world required constant attention, constant adjustment, constant effort to maintain the relationships that made their lives possible. The walk to work became a social journey. Romans would encounter neighbors, exchange greetings, share information, make plans for later. These brief interactions weren't just politeness, they were the threads that wove the community together, the daily renewals of the social contracts that governed their lives. Even the most routine interactions required skill. How to greet someone appropriately, how to show interest in their well-being without being intrusive, how to share information without gossiping, how to maintain relationships without being clingy or demanding. Romans learned these skills through practice, through observation, through the gentle corrections of their community. The midday break became another opportunity for social connection. Romans would gather in shaded areas, sharing simple meals, talking about their work, planning their evenings. These breaks weren't just about rest. They were about maintaining the social bonds that made work bearable, that provided support during difficult times, that created the networks of mutual aid that sustained communities. Romans understood that work wasn't just about individual achievement. It was about contributing to the community, about maintaining the relationships that made commerce possible, about building the reputation that would sustain them through lean times. They worked not just for themselves, but for their families, their neighbors, their communities. The afternoon brought its own challenges and opportunities. As the heat of the day built, Romans would adjust their activities, would find cooler places to work, would take advantage of the quieter hours for tasks that required concentration. They learned to read the rhythms of their environment, to work with nature rather than against it, to find efficiency through cooperation rather than competition. The late afternoon was often when Romans would handle their most delicate social business, when they needed to have difficult conversations, to resolve conflicts, to make important decisions. The combination of fatigue and the approaching end of the day created an atmosphere where people were more willing to compromise, more eager to find solutions, more focused on maintaining harmony. Romans learned to time their social interactions carefully, to choose the right moments for different kinds of conversations, to read the moods and energy levels of others. They understood that successful social navigation required not just skill, but timing, not just intention, but attention to context. The evening meal became the culmination of the day's social efforts. Families would gather to share food, to talk about their day, to plan for tomorrow. But even these private moments were influenced by the broader community. The food they ate, the conversations they had, the plans they made, all of these were shaped by the relationships they maintained with their neighbors. Romans understood that family life and community life weren't separate things. They were interconnected, mutually reinforcing aspects of a single social system. Strong families created strong communities, and strong communities supported strong families. The art of getting along with neighbors was really the art of creating the conditions where both could thrive. The bedtime rituals became opportunities for reflection, for processing the day's social interactions, for preparing for the next day's challenges. Romans would review their conversations, would consider how they'd handle different situations, would plan how they might do better tomorrow. They understood that social skills, like any other skills, required constant practice and improvement. The sounds of the building settling into sleep became a kind of lullaby, a reminder that the community was safe, that everyone was where they belonged, that the complex social machinery of neighborhood life was functioning properly. Romans fell asleep, not in isolation, but surrounded by the gentle sounds of their neighbors, secure in the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. This was the real genius of Roman neighborhood life, not the grand architecture or the famous conquests, but the simple recognition that humans are social creatures who need each other to survive and thrive. They created systems that honored both individual dignity and collective well-being, that balanced personal freedom with social responsibility, that found ways to turn the challenges of crowded living into opportunities for deeper connection. The lessons they learned about getting along with neighbors weren't just practical skills. They were wisdom about human nature, about the conditions that allow communities to flourish, about the delicate balance between self-interest and mutual aid that makes civilization possible. They understood that neighbors aren't just people who happen to live nearby. They're the people who share your daily life, who witness your struggles and your successes, who help you navigate the complex business of being human in a complicated world. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about those Roman neighbors one more time. Think about how they turned the potential chaos of crowded living into the actual harmony of functioning communities. Think about how they created order not through rules and regulations, but through relationships and mutual respect. Think about how they found ways to honor both individual needs and collective well-being, to balance personal freedom with social responsibility. Their apartment buildings have crumbled, their streets have been buried, their names have been forgotten. But their example remains, whispering across the centuries about the possibilities that exist when people choose cooperation over conflict, when they invest in relationships rather than walls, when they understand that getting along with neighbors is really about getting along with life itself. In our modern world of suburban isolation and digital connection, we've forgotten many of the skills that Romans took for granted. We've gained privacy and personal space, but we've lost something too. We've lost the daily practice of navigating complex social relationships, the security of knowing that our neighbors are watching out for us, the satisfaction of being part of a community that works. But we can learn from the Romans. We can remember that neighbors aren't just people who happen to live nearby. They're potential allies, potential friends, potential sources of support and connection. We can choose to invest in those relationships, to practice the ancient arts of cooperation and mutual aid, to create communities that honor both individual dignity and collective well-being. The Romans showed us that it's possible. In the crowded, chaotic, often difficult conditions of ancient city life, they found ways to live together peacefully, to support each other through hard times, to create communities that lasted for centuries. They did it not through grand gestures or heroic acts, but through the quiet daily practice of treating their neighbors with respect, kindness, and understanding. Their voices have been silent for generations, but their example endures. In every act of neighborly kindness, in every moment of community cooperation, in every choice to build bridges rather than walls, we honor their memory and continue their work. The art of getting along with neighbors is really the art of being human, and the Romans were some of the best teachers we've ever had. So tomorrow, when you see your neighbors, remember the Romans. Remember that every interaction is an opportunity to build trust, that every kindness creates a stronger community, that the simple act of getting along with the people who share your world is one of the most important things you can do. Remember that in a world full of strangers, your neighbors are the people who can help you find your way home. And that home isn't just a place, it's a feeling, a sense of belonging, a knowledge that you're part of something larger than yourself. The Romans knew this. They lived it every day. And their example reminds us that no matter how complicated our world becomes, no matter how isolated we feel, no matter how difficult our circumstances, there's always the possibility of connection, of community, of finding ways to live together peacefully. All it takes is the willingness to see our neighbors not as strangers or obstacles, but as fellow travelers on the long, difficult, beautiful journey of being human. The night deepens, the world grows quiet, and in the silence, we can almost hear the echoes of those ancient Roman voices, whispering across the centuries about the simple, profound truth that we're all in this together. That getting along with neighbors isn't just about being polite or avoiding conflict. It's about creating the conditions where everyone can thrive, where communities can flourish, where the best of human nature can emerge from the challenges of daily life. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the darkness your neighbors are sleeping too, and that in the morning there will be new opportunities to build the kinds of relationships that make life worth living. The Romans would understand. They always did. The Roman approach to neighborly disputes reveals something profound about human nature. They understood that conflict wasn't something to be avoided at all costs, but rather something to be managed with skill and grace. Every disagreement was an opportunity to either strengthen or weaken the bonds that held their communities together. When tensions arose, Romans had developed what we might call the art of strategic patience. They didn't rush to confront problems directly. Instead, they would watch, wait, and gather information. They understood that most conflicts had deeper roots than what appeared on the surface, and that addressing symptoms without understanding causes often made things worse. Take the common problem of borrowed items that weren't returned. In our modern world, we might send a text message or make a direct phone call. But Romans lived in a world where direct confrontation could have lasting consequences for relationships that had to endure for years or even decades. So when Marcus borrowed a cooking pot from his neighbor and didn't return it promptly, the neighbor didn't march upstairs and demand it back. Instead, she would wait for a natural opportunity to mention it. Perhaps she'd run into Marcus at the fountain and casually mention that she was planning to cook something special for her family, something that required her largest pot, not accusatory, not demanding, just sharing information that would remind Marcus of his obligation. Most people would take the hint immediately. Marcus would remember the borrowed pot, apologize for keeping it so long, and return it that very day. The relationship would be preserved, the problem would be solved, and both parties would maintain their dignity. But what if Marcus didn't take the hint? What if he was genuinely forgetful, or distracted by other problems, or simply inconsiderate? The neighbor would escalate gradually, each step carefully calculated to increase pressure without destroying the relationship. She might mention her missing pot to another neighbor, perhaps while Marcus was within earshot. Or she might ask to borrow a similar item from someone else, making it clear that she needed it because her own pot was unavailable. The social pressure would build naturally, organically, without anyone having to make accusations or ultimatums. This indirect approach required enormous patience and skill. You had to be able to read social cues, to understand when someone was genuinely confused, versus when they were deliberately avoiding their obligations. You had to know how much pressure to apply and when to back off. You had to maintain your own dignity while allowing others to save face. But Romans understood that this investment of time and energy was worth it. Because once you had a reputation for being unreasonable, for making mountains out of molehills, for being someone who couldn't be trusted to handle small problems gracefully, that reputation would follow you everywhere. Other neighbors would be less likely to help you, less willing to lend you things, less inclined to include you in the informal networks that made life bearable. The same principles applied to more serious conflicts. When neighbours had disputes about property boundaries or noise or children's behaviour, Romans would follow similar patterns of escalation. They would start with gentle hints, move to more direct suggestions, involve mutual friends as mediators, and only rarely resort to anything approaching formal confrontation. The role of children in these conflicts was particularly interesting. Romans understood that children were both innocent victims and potential weapons in neighbourhood disputes. A child's misbehaviour could reflect poorly on their parents, but children could also be used to send messages, to gather information, or to create situations that would force adults to address problems they'd been avoiding. When the baker's son kept throwing stones at other children in the courtyard, the parents of the injured children didn't immediately march to the bakery demanding punishment. Instead, they would find ways to address the problem that allowed the baker to maintain his authority as a parent while ensuring the safety of their own children. They might suggest organized games that would channel the boy's energy in more positive directions. They might invite him to help with small tasks that would make him feel important and valued. They might even speak to the boy directly in ways that showed respect for his parents' authority while making it clear that his behavior was unacceptable. The baker, recognizing these gentle interventions, would usually respond by taking more direct control of his son's behavior. He might keep the boy closer to home, might find him work in the bakery that would keep him occupied, might impose punishments that would demonstrate to the neighbours that he was taking their concerns seriously. This collaborative approach to child rearing was essential in communities where everyone lived so close together. Parents understood that their children's behaviour affected the entire neighbourhood, and neighbours understood that helping to guide children was part of their responsibility to the community. But this system only worked because it was based on mutual respect and shared values. Everyone agreed that children should be taught to be considerate of others, that parents had primary responsibility for their children's behaviour, and that the community had a right to expect reasonable standards of conduct. When these shared values broke down, when parents refused to acknowledge their children's misbehaviour, or when neighbours overstepped their bounds in trying to discipline other people's children, the results could be explosive. These were the conflicts that could tear communities apart, that could create lasting resentments and permanent divisions. Romans worked hard to prevent such breakdowns. They invested enormous energy in maintaining the delicate balance between individual family autonomy and community standards. They understood that this balance was fragile, that it required constant attention and adjustment, that it could be destroyed by a single moment of poor judgment or excessive pride. The economic dimensions of neighbourly relationships added another layer of complexity. In a world where formal banking was limited and legal protections were minimal, your neighbours were often your business partners, your creditors, your investors, and your customers all rolled into one. When the shoemaker on the first floor needed leather to make sandals, he might arrange to buy it from a neighbour who worked in the tanning trade. But this wasn't just a simple commercial transaction. It was the beginning of a relationship that would affect how these two men interacted for months or years to come. The terms of the deal would be negotiated not just based on market prices, but on the existing relationship between the two men, their reputations in the community, their family obligations, and their long-term business prospects. The shoemaker might pay a little more than the market price in exchange for reliable quality and flexible payment terms. The tanner might accept a lower profit margin in exchange for a steady customer who could be counted on to pay eventually. But what happened when the shoemaker's business slowed down and he couldn't pay for the leather on time? In our modern world, this might result in collection agencies, legal proceedings, or formal bankruptcy. But Romans had to find ways to handle such problems that preserved both the business relationship and the personal relationship between neighbours. The tanner might extend the payment terms, perhaps in exchange for a small amount of additional interest or a promise of future business. Or he might accept partial payment in the form of finished shoes rather than cash. Or he might arrange for the shoemaker to work off the debt by helping with other projects during slow periods. The goal was always to find solutions that allowed both parties to maintain their dignity while preserving the relationship that made future business possible. Romans understood that destroying a business relationship over a single transaction was usually more costly than finding creative ways to work through temporary problems. This approach required a completely different mindset from our modern emphasis on contracts, legal remedies, and formal dispute resolution. Romans had to be willing to take risks, to trust in relationships rather than rules, to find personal solutions to business problems. But this system also created incredibly strong networks of mutual support. When the shoemaker's wife fell ill and he needed money for medical care, the tanner might advance him payment for future work. When the tanner's warehouse flooded and he lost inventory, the shoemaker might help him contact other customers who could provide temporary income. These weren't acts of charity. They were investments in relationships, recognition that in a world where formal institutions were weak, personal networks were everything. Romans understood that helping your neighbors succeed was the best way to ensure your own success. That building trust was more valuable than maximizing short-term profits. The seasonal rhythms of Roman life created natural opportunities for community building and relationship maintenance. Each season brought its own challenges and opportunities, its own reasons for neighbors to come together or to give each other space. Spring was the season of renewal, when apartments were cleaned, repairs were made, and relationships were refreshed after the close quarters of winter. This was when new neighbors were most likely to be welcomed into the community, when old grudges were most likely to be forgotten, when people were most optimistic about the possibilities for positive change. The spring cleaning wasn't just about making living spaces more comfortable. It was about preparing for the year ahead, about creating the conditions where communities could thrive. Neighbors would help each other with major cleaning projects, would share tools and materials, would coordinate their efforts to make the whole building more pleasant to live in. This was also when Romans would assess the relationships they'd built over the previous year, would decide which ones were worth maintaining and which ones needed to be allowed to fade. Spring was a time for making changes, for trying new approaches, for experimenting with different ways of relating to their neighbors. Summer brought its own dynamics. The heat drove people out of their apartments and into shared spaces, creating more opportunities for interaction, but also more potential for conflict. Romans had to learn to manage the increased social intensity of summer living, to find ways to enjoy each other's company without getting on each other's nerves. The evening gatherings in courtyards became more elaborate during summer months. People would bring food to share, would organize games and entertainment, would create informal festivals that brought the whole community together. These weren't just social events. They were investments in community cohesion, opportunities to strengthen the bonds that would carry everyone through the harder times ahead. But summer also brought challenges. The heat made everyone more irritable, more likely to snap at neighbors over small problems. The increased social interaction meant more opportunities for misunderstandings, for conflicts to develop, for relationships to be strained. Romans learned to anticipate these summer tensions and to plan for them. They would make extra efforts to be patient with their neighbors, would find ways to give each other space even in crowded conditions, would develop strategies for cooling down conflicts before they escalated. The evening routines became particularly important during summer months. As the sun set and the temperature dropped, people would emerge from their apartments to enjoy the cooler air. These transition times were when much of the real community building happened, when people could relax and connect without the pressure of work or the stress of daytime heat. Autumn brought preparation for winter, but also a kind of social harvest. Romans would assess the relationships they'd built over the year, would strengthen the ones that seemed most valuable, would prepare for the closer quarters and increased dependence that winter would bring. This was when favors were called in, when debts were settled, when agreements were made about how to handle the challenges of the cold months ahead. Romans understood that winter survival depended on summer preparation, not just in terms of food and fuel, but in terms of the social networks that would sustain them through the difficult months. The autumn festivals became opportunities for community celebration, for acknowledging the year's successes and failures, for renewing the commitments that held neighborhoods together. These weren't just religious observances, they were social renewals, opportunities to remind everyone why they chose to live together, why they worked so hard to maintain their relationships with their neighbors. Winter brought everything into sharp focus. The cold drove people indoors, but it also created new opportunities for intimacy and connection. Romans would spend long evenings together, sharing stories, playing games, working on projects that required collaboration. The winter months tested every relationship, every social skill, every community bond. When people were cooped up together for months, when resources were scarce, when the daily challenges of survival took precedence over social niceties, the true strength of neighborhoods became apparent. Some communities thrived during winter, becoming closer and more cooperative. Others fractured under the pressure, with relationships breaking down and neighbors turning against each other. The difference usually came down to how well they'd prepared, not just materially, but socially. Romans who had invested in their relationships during the easier months found that winter brought them closer to their neighbors. The shared challenges created shared bonds. The mutual dependence created mutual loyalty. The long evenings created opportunities for deeper friendships. But those who had neglected their relationships, who had taken their neighbors for granted, who had failed to build the trust and goodwill that winter survival required, found themselves isolated and vulnerable. They might have adequate food and fuel, but they lacked the social support that made winter bearable. The Roman calendar was structured around these seasonal rhythms, with festivals and observances that helped communities navigate the transitions between different phases of the year. These weren't just religious events, they were social technologies, ways of managing the complex dynamics of community life. The midwinter festivals were particularly important. When the days were shortest and the cold was most intense, Romans would create artificial reasons for celebration, for coming together, for remembering that even in the darkest times, they were part of something larger than themselves. These festivals weren't elaborate or expensive. They were simple gatherings where people shared what they had, where children played while adults talked, where the whole community reminded itself that winter was temporary and that spring would come again. The gift-giving traditions that developed around these festivals weren't about material exchange. They were about acknowledging relationships, about expressing gratitude for the support that neighbors had provided throughout the year, about making commitments for the year ahead. Romans understood that these rituals weren't just nice traditions. They were essential practices that maintained the social fabric of their communities, that helped people navigate the challenges of living together in difficult conditions, that created the conditions where neighborhoods could thrive. The role of memory in Roman neighborhood life was crucial. In a world without written records, without formal institutions, without the kind of documentation we take for granted, everything depended on people remembering their obligations, their debts, their promises, their relationships. Romans developed extraordinary memories for social information. They could remember who had helped them during difficult times, who had failed to keep their promises, who could be trusted with important information, who had earned respect through their actions. This social memory wasn't just individual, it was collective, shared across the community through stories, conversations, and informal networks. The reputation of every person was constantly being evaluated, updated, and transmitted through these networks. When someone new moved into the neighborhood, Romans would share information about them, would help each other understand how to relate to them, would gradually build the collective memory that would govern future interactions. When someone died, their social memory would be preserved and transmitted to the next generation. Children would learn about their parents' relationships, would inherit both the benefits and the obligations that came with those relationships. would gradually take over the social roles that their parents had played. This continuity was essential to the stability of Roman neighborhoods. It meant that relationships could survive individual deaths, that communities could maintain their character across generations, that the social investments made by one generation could benefit the next. But this system also meant that mistakes, conflicts, and failures could be remembered for generations. A reputation for untrustworthiness could be passed down like a family curse, affecting not just the individual who had earned it, but their children and grandchildren as well. Romans understood this and worked hard to maintain good reputations, not just for themselves, but for their families. They knew that their actions would be remembered, that their behavior would affect not just their own lives, but the lives of their descendants. The stories that Romans told about their neighbors served multiple functions. They were entertainment, but they were also education, ways of transmitting social wisdom, of teaching people how to behave, of preserving the values that held communities together. When children heard stories about neighbors who had been generous during hard times, they learned about the importance of mutual aid. When they heard about people who had broken their promises and suffered social consequences, they learned about the importance of keeping their word. These stories weren't just random gossip. They were carefully crafted narratives that reinforced community values, that taught social skills, that helped people understand the complex dynamics of neighborhood life. The best storytellers were highly valued in Roman communities. They weren't just entertainers. They were social historians, moral teachers, and community leaders. Their stories helped people make sense of their relationships, understand their obligations, and navigate the challenges of living together. As the years passed and neighborhoods evolved, these stories would be updated, modified, and retold to reflect changing circumstances. But the core messages remained constant: that neighbors were important, that relationships mattered, that communities required constant effort to maintain. The physical spaces where Romans lived shaped their social relationships in profound ways. The narrow stairs, the shared courtyards, the thin walls, all of these created opportunities for interaction but also challenges for privacy and autonomy. Romans learned to navigate these spaces with extraordinary skill. They developed ways of moving through shared areas that minimized conflict, ways of using space that respected others' needs, ways of creating privacy even in crowded conditions. The morning rush to the fountain became a carefully choreographed dance. People would time their trips to avoid the busiest periods, would help each other carry heavy water jugs, would create informal queues that moved efficiently without creating tension. The afternoon rest period became a time when noise levels naturally dropped, when people would retreat to their apartments for quiet activities, when the shared spaces would empty to allow for cleaning and maintenance. The evening gatherings would fill the courtyards with activity, but even these had their own rhythms and boundaries. People would naturally cluster in groups, would find ways to have private conversations in public spaces, would gradually disperse as the night wore on. These patterns weren't imposed by rules or regulations. They emerged naturally from the daily interactions of people who had learned to live together successfully. They were constantly evolving, constantly being adjusted to meet changing needs and circumstances. The physical environment also created opportunities for creativity and innovation. Romans would find ways to use limited space more efficiently, would develop new techniques for managing shared resources, would create informal systems for maintaining common areas. The children were often the most creative in adapting to these physical constraints. They would invent games that could be played in narrow corridors, would find hiding places in the most unlikely spaces, would develop skills for moving quietly through thin-walled buildings. Adults would watch these adaptations and learn from them, would incorporate the children's innovations into their own daily routines, would find new ways to make their living spaces more comfortable and efficient. The seasonal changes in how spaces were used added another layer of complexity. Summer would bring cooking and eating outdoors. Winter would drive everything indoors. Spring would bring cleaning and reorganization. Autumn would bring preparation and storage. Romans learned to anticipate these changes and to plan for them. They would rearrange furniture, would modify routines, would adjust their expectations about privacy and noise levels to match the changing seasons. The most successful neighborhoods were those that could adapt their use of space to meet changing needs without creating conflict or resentment. This required constant communication, negotiation, and compromise. But it also created communities that were resilient and flexible. The building itself became a kind of extended family, with its own personality, its own traditions, its own ways of handling problems. People would develop emotional attachments to their physical spaces, would take pride in maintaining them, would feel genuine grief when they had to leave. These attachments weren't just sentimental, they were practical recognition that the physical environment shaped social relationships, that investing in the building was investing in the community, that creating beautiful and comfortable spaces was a way of honoring the relationships that made them possible. The sounds of Roman neighborhood life created their own complex symphony. The rhythmic pounding of bread dough, the splash of water being poured, the laughter of children, the conversations of adults, the creaking of wooden stairs, all of these became the soundtrack of daily life. Romans learned to read these sounds like a language. They could tell from the footsteps on the stairs whether someone was hurrying to work or coming home tired. They could distinguish between the sounds of normal activity and the sounds of distress or celebration. The sounds also created a sense of shared experience. When everyone could hear the same baby crying, the same couple arguing, the same children playing, it created a kind of collective awareness that made the community feel more connected. But Romans also learned to manage sounds carefully. They understood that noise could be either a source of comfort or a source of conflict, depending on how it was handled. They developed subtle ways of communicating through sound, of showing consideration for their neighbors, of creating the kind of acoustic environment that everyone could live with. The morning sounds would gradually build as the building woke up, creating a natural rhythm that helped everyone coordinate their activities. The evening sounds would gradually fade as people settled down for the night, creating a sense of closure and rest. These acoustic patterns weren't just background noise. They were part of the social fabric of the community, part of how people stayed connected to each other, part of what made the building feel like home rather than just a place to sleep. The Romans understood something that we've forgotten in our modern world of soundproofing and noise ordinances. They understood that some sounds are meant to be shared, that the acoustic environment is part of what creates community, that learning to live with your neighbor's sounds is part of learning to live with your neighbors. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet of your own space, think about those Roman sounds. Think about the comfort of knowing that your neighbors are nearby, that their daily rhythms are intertwined with yours, that the sounds of their lives are part of the music of your own. The Romans created communities not by avoiding each other, but by learning to live together gracefully. They understood that neighbors aren't just people who happen to live nearby. They're the people who share your daily soundtrack, who witness your private moments, who help create the acoustic environment that shapes your experience of home. Their sounds have been silent for centuries, but their example remains. In every moment, when we choose to be considerate of our neighbors, when we recognize that our actions affect others, when we work to create the kind of community where everyone can thrive, we honor their memory and continue their work. The art of getting along with neighbors isn't just about being polite or avoiding conflict. It's about recognizing that we're all part of the same human symphony, that our individual voices are most beautiful when they harmonize with others, that the sounds of community are some of the most comforting sounds we can hear. Sleep well, knowing that in the morning there will be new opportunities to add your voice to that symphony, to contribute to the sounds of community, to help create the kind of acoustic environment where everyone can feel at home. The Romans would understand. They always did. The Roman legal system, such as it was for ordinary people living in cramped apartments and shared courtyards, couldn't possibly handle every small dispute that bubbled up between neighbors. Most conflicts had to be resolved through the delicate art of persuasion, the quiet pressure of social expectation, and the kind of patient diplomacy that comes from knowing you'll have to see these same faces every single day for years to come. When disagreements arose, they were usually handled by the most respected members of the community, not necessarily the wealthiest or the oldest, but the people who had earned trust through years of fair dealing, who had proven themselves capable of listening to both sides of a story without taking sides, who understood that their real job wasn't to determine who was right and who was wrong, but to find ways for everyone to keep living together without wanting to strangle each other. Picture old Helena, who had lived in the same building for 30 years, who had seen neighbors come and go, who had mediated countless disputes over borrowed tools, crying babies, and the eternal problem of whose turn it was to clean the shared areas. When two families started arguing about whose children were making too much noise in the courtyard, Helena wouldn't call for silence or impose arbitrary rules. Instead, she'd suggest that maybe the children could play their louder games in the morning when everyone was already awake, and save the quieter activities for the afternoon when people were trying to rest. The goal was never to punish anyone, or to establish precedents that would govern future behavior. It was to restore the kind of harmony that made daily life bearable, to find compromises that everyone could live with, even if no one was completely satisfied. Helena understood that perfect solutions were rare, but workable solutions were essential. The enforcement of these informal agreements relied entirely on something more powerful than any law: the fear of being cut off from the community that sustained you. If someone violated an agreement that the neighborhood had reached, if they consistently ignored the gentle pressures and polite suggestions that kept everyone else in line, they might find themselves gradually isolated from the social networks that made life possible. It wasn't dramatic. There were no trials, no public punishments, no formal declarations of guilt. Instead, people would simply become a little less helpful, a little less friendly, a little less willing to share information or offer assistance. The offender might find themselves at the back of the line at the fountain more often than seemed like coincidence. They might discover that their neighbors had somehow forgotten to mention job opportunities or good deals at the market. This social isolation was devastating in a world where your neighbors were your safety net, your information network, your emergency services, and your entertainment all rolled into one. Most people would rather swallow their pride and apologize than face the prospect of being truly alone in a crowded city. But Romans understood that people make mistakes, that circumstances change, that holding grudges forever was more destructive than the original offense. The system had built-in mechanisms for forgiveness, ways for people to earn their way back into the community's good graces. Someone who showed genuine remorse, who made real efforts to change their behavior, who demonstrated that they understood why their actions had been harmful, could usually find their way back to acceptance. The economic relationships between neighbors added layers of complexity that would challenge even the most skilled diplomats. In a world where formal banking was limited and legal protections were minimal, your neighbors were often your business partners, your creditors, your customers, and your competitors, all at the same time. The baker who sold you bread in the morning might be the same person you owed money to from last month's emergency loan. The woman who bought your pottery might also be the one whose chickens kept wandering into your courtyard. These overlapping relationships had to be managed with extraordinary care. Romans developed sophisticated ways of separating business dealings from personal relationships, of maintaining friendships even when money was involved, of handling debts and obligations without destroying the social fabric that held their communities together. When the potter down the hall needed clay but couldn't afford to pay for it immediately, he might arrange with the supplier to work off the debt by helping with other projects. Not just carrying heavy loads or doing manual labor, but using his skills as a craftsman to help repair tools, create small items for trade, or teach the supplier's children the basics of working with clay. The debt became an opportunity to strengthen the relationship rather than a source of tension. The Romans had learned that money could either build bridges or burn them, depending on how it was handled. They developed elaborate rituals around borrowing and lending, ways of structuring deals that protected both parties while preserving their dignity. When someone borrowed money, they would often provide some form of collateral, not as security for the loan, but as a symbol of their commitment to repay it. A treasured family heirloom, a tool essential to their trade, something that represented their honor and their intention to make good on their word. But these weren't cold commercial transactions. They were personal relationships disguised as business deals. The lender would inquire about the borrower's family, would offer advice about managing finances, would sometimes extend the terms of the loan if circumstances changed. The borrower would provide updates on their situation, would offer small gifts or services as tokens of appreciation, would look for opportunities to help the lender in return. The workshops and small businesses that operated out of ground floor apartments created another dimension of neighborhood economics. The shoemaker's shop wasn't just a place of business. It was a social center where neighbors gathered to talk, to share news, to conduct their own informal transactions. The shoemaker knew everyone in the building, understood their financial situations, their family dynamics, their personal quirks. When someone needed new sandals but couldn't afford to pay immediately, the shoemaker might accept payment in installments, or trade for other goods and services, or simply extend credit based on his knowledge of the person's character and circumstances. These weren't business decisions made by calculating profit margins and risk assessments. They were personal choices based on relationships, trust, and the understanding that everyone's success was interconnected. The children growing up in these neighborhoods absorbed these lessons through daily observation. They watched their parents navigate complex webs of obligation and reciprocity, saw how successful adults balanced individual needs with community responsibilities, learned that reputation was more valuable than money, and that relationships were more important than rules. By the time they reached adulthood, these children had developed an intuitive understanding of how to read social situations, how to negotiate conflicts, how to build trust, how to contribute to community life. They knew which neighbors could be counted on in emergencies, which ones were good for business partnerships, which ones were reliable sources of information, which ones were best avoided during times of stress. This informal education system produced generations of Romans who were skilled at living together in crowded, challenging conditions. They learned to find cooperation within competition, to create order from chaos, to build communities that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character. The religious life of Roman neighborhoods was woven so tightly into daily social relationships that it was impossible to separate sacred from secular, spiritual from practical. Each building had its own small shrines, its own protective deities, its own rituals that marked the passing of days and seasons. These weren't grand theological statements, but intimate practices that helped people navigate the challenges of living together. The household gods, the lares and penates, were like invisible neighbors who had to be kept happy if you wanted your life to run smoothly. Families would leave small offerings of food and wine at their shrines, would whisper prayers for protection and prosperity, would involve these deities in their daily decision-making. But these practices weren't private. They were part of the social fabric of the neighborhood, ways of demonstrating your commitment to the community's shared values. When someone fell ill, neighbors would gather to make offerings at the household shrine, would pool their resources to hire priests for special ceremonies, would take turns sitting with the sick person, while family members attended to the rituals that might help with healing. The boundary between medical care and spiritual care, between individual need and community responsibility, was fluid and permeable. The local festivals gave neighborhoods excuses to come together, to share food and drink, to celebrate as a community. During Saturnalia in December, the normal social hierarchies were temporarily suspended. The baker might serve bread to his customers. The landlord might carry water for his tenants. Children could speak freely to adults they normally had to treat with formal respect. These role reversals weren't just fun and games. They were pressure valves that allowed communities to blow off steam, to acknowledge the arbitrary nature of social distinctions, to remind everyone that underneath their different roles and responsibilities, they were all human beings with the same basic needs and desires. But even during these celebrations, there were boundaries that couldn't be crossed. You could be more familiar with your neighbors than usual, could drink more wine than was normally considered appropriate, could speak more freely about things that were usually kept private. But you still had to live with these people after the festival ended, still had to maintain the relationships that made daily life possible. The Romans understood that temporary license required more social skill, not less. It was easier to be polite and formal with someone you saw every day than to be genuinely intimate with them for a few days and then return to normal social distance. The festivals tested everyone's ability to navigate complex emotional terrain, to be authentic without being destructive, to celebrate without creating lasting resentments. The changing seasons brought natural rhythms that helped organize community life. Romans didn't have clocks or calendars in the modern sense, but they had something better, a deep understanding of the natural cycles that governed their world. They knew that spring was the time for cleaning and renewal, that summer was for building and expanding, that autumn was for harvesting and preparing, that winter was for conserving and enduring. These seasonal rhythms created predictable patterns of social interaction. Spring brought community work projects, shared efforts to repair buildings, clean common areas, and prepare for the year ahead. Summer brought outdoor gatherings, festivals, and the kind of intense social activity that was possible when people didn't have to worry about staying warm. Autumn brought preparations for winter, the careful negotiations about resource sharing, the strengthening of bonds that would have to sustain everyone through the difficult months ahead. Winter brought everything into sharp focus. The cold drove people indoors, but it also created opportunities for different kinds of community building. Romans would gather in the warmest apartments, would share fuel and food, would spend long evenings telling stories, playing games, working on projects that required collaboration. These weren't just survival strategies, they were ways of creating meaning, of finding purpose in the midst of hardship, of building the kinds of relationships that made life worth living even in difficult circumstances. The Romans understood that community wasn't just about practical cooperation. It was about emotional support, intellectual stimulation, spiritual connection. The stories that Romans told during these long winter evenings weren't just entertainment. They were ways of preserving history, of transmitting values, of teaching social skills, of creating shared memories that would bind the community together. The best storytellers were highly valued, not just for their ability to entertain, but for their skill at weaving together the threads of community life into coherent narratives. These stories would be updated and modified as circumstances changed, but their core messages remained constant. That neighbors mattered, that relationships were more important than individual success, that communities required constant effort to maintain, but were worth the investment. The physical spaces where Romans lived shaped their social relationships in profound ways. The narrow hallways forced people to interact, to negotiate passage, to acknowledge each other's presence. The shared courtyards created natural gathering places where informal conversations could develop into deeper relationships. The thin walls meant that privacy was a luxury that had to be carefully managed rather than taken for granted. Romans learned to move through these spaces with extraordinary grace. They developed ways of greeting neighbors that were warm but not intrusive, ways of conducting private conversations in public spaces, ways of creating the illusion of solitude, even in crowded conditions. They understood that the art of living together required constant attention to the subtle signals that people send about their need for interaction or their desire for space. The morning rush to the fountain became a carefully choreographed dance. People would time their trips to avoid the busiest periods, would help elderly neighbors carry heavy water jugs, would create informal cues that moved efficiently without creating tension. The fountain became more than just a source of water. It was a news center, a social hub, a place where the community came together to share information and maintain relationships. The evening gatherings in the courtyards were more complex social events. People would bring food to share, would organize games for the children, would create opportunities for different kinds of interaction. Young people would flirt while pretending to be interested in other activities. Adults would conduct business while appearing to engage in casual conversation. Elderly residents would tell stories while actually transmitting important social information. These gatherings weren't planned or organized in any formal sense. They emerged naturally from the daily rhythms of community life, from people's need for social connection, from the understanding that isolation was dangerous and community was essential. The most successful neighborhoods were those where these informal gatherings felt comfortable and inclusive, where people could participate at their own level without feeling pressured or excluded. The sounds of Roman neighborhood life created their own complex language. The rhythmic pounding of bread dough told everyone that the baker was working, that fresh bread would be available soon, that the day was progressing normally. The splash of water being poured meant that someone was cooking, cleaning, or preparing for the day ahead. The laughter of children indicated that the community was healthy, that the next generation was thriving, that there was still room for joy in the midst of daily struggles. Romans learned to read these sounds like a musical score. They could distinguish between the footsteps of different neighbors, could tell from the tone of conversations whether they were witnessing normal social interaction or something that might require intervention. They could identify the sounds of distress, of celebration, of normal daily activity, and would respond appropriately to each. The sounds also created a sense of shared experience that bound the community together. When everyone could hear the same baby crying, the same couple arguing, the same children playing, it created a kind of collective awareness that made individual problems feel like community concerns. People would respond to distress not because they were formally obligated to help, but because they felt emotionally connected to their neighbors' experiences. But Romans also learned to manage sounds carefully, to be considerate of their neighbors' need for quiet, to find ways of conducting necessary activities without creating unreasonable disturbances. They developed techniques for moving quietly through shared spaces, for conducting conversations at appropriate volumes, for timing noisy activities to minimize their impact on others. The acoustic environment of Roman neighborhoods was part of what made them feel like home, rather than just places to sleep. The familiar sounds of daily life created a sense of continuity and security, a knowledge that the community was functioning normally, that everyone was safe and accounted for. As night fell and the sounds gradually faded, Romans would settle into sleep surrounded by the quiet breathing of their neighbors, the gentle creaking of wooden buildings, the distant sounds of the city settling into rest. These weren't intrusions on their privacy. They were lullabies, reminders that they were part of something larger than themselves, that they were safe and cared for and connected to the ongoing life of their community. The Romans understood something that we've forgotten in our modern world of soundproofing and noise ordinances. They understood that some sounds are meant to be shared, that the acoustic environment is part of what creates community, that learning to live with your neighbor's sounds is part of learning to live with your neighbors. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet of your own space, think about those Roman sounds. Think about the comfort of knowing that your neighbors are nearby, that their daily rhythms are intertwined with yours, that the sounds of their lives are part of the music that makes your own life feel complete and connected. The Romans created communities not by avoiding each other, but by learning to live together gracefully, to find harmony in the midst of chaos, to build relationships that could survive the daily friction of crowded living. They understood that neighbors aren't just people who happen to live nearby. They're the people who share your daily soundtrack, who witness your private moments, who help create the acoustic environment that shapes your experience of home. Their sounds have been silent for centuries, but their example remains. In every moment when we choose to be considerate of our neighbors, when we recognize that our actions affect others, when we work to create the kind of community where everyone can thrive, we honor their memory and continue their work. The art of getting along with neighbors isn't just about being polite or avoiding conflict. It's about recognizing that we're all part of the same human symphony, that our individual voices are most beautiful when they harmonize with others, that the sounds of community are some of the most comforting sounds we can hear. In the gentle rhythm of Roman daily life, in the patient wisdom of their social customs, in the quiet heroism of ordinary people who chose cooperation over conflict, we find lessons that whisper across the centuries. Lessons about the delicate art of living together, about the patient work of building community, about the profound truth that home isn't just a place but a feeling, a sense of belonging, a knowledge that you're part of something larger than yourself. The apartment buildings of ancient Rome have crumbled into dust, but the communities they sheltered live on in memory, in example, in the quiet understanding that getting along with neighbors is really about getting along with life itself. Tomorrow, when you encounter your own neighbors, remember the Romans. Remember that every interaction is an opportunity to build trust, that every kindness creates a stronger community, that the simple act of treating others with respect and consideration is one of the most important things you can do. Sleep well, knowing that in the morning there will be new opportunities to practice the ancient art of neighborliness, to contribute to the ongoing work of community building, to help create the kind of world where everyone can feel at home. The Romans would understand. They always did. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city still held its breath between night and day, Romans would sometimes pause in their daily routines and reflect on what they had built together. Not monuments of stone or marble, but something far more precious and far more fragile. Communities that worked, relationships that endured, the kind of social fabric that could hold together under pressure, that could bend without breaking, that could adapt to change while preserving its essential character. They had learned that getting along with neighbors wasn't just about following rules or avoiding conflict. It was about understanding that every human interaction was an opportunity to either strengthen or weaken the bonds that held their world together. Every conversation at the fountain, every shared meal in the courtyard, every moment of patience during a difficult time, every act of kindness during a neighbor's crisis, these were the threads that wove together into something larger than any individual life. The Romans understood that civilization wasn't built by heroes or emperors or great architects. It was built by ordinary people making ordinary choices day after day, year after year. The choice to help rather than ignore, to forgive rather than hold grudges, to include rather than exclude, to build bridges rather than walls. They knew that their apartment buildings were temporary, that their individual lives were brief, that the specific problems they faced would be forgotten within a generation. But they also knew that the patterns they created, the relationships they built, the communities they sustained, these would echo forward through time, shaping the lives of people they would never meet, influencing the world in ways they could never fully understand. In the gentle rhythm of morning greetings and evening farewells, in the patient negotiation of shared spaces and common resources, in the quiet heroism of people who chose cooperation over conflict, Romans created something that lasted far longer than any building, far longer than any empire. They created a template for human community, a set of practices and principles that could be adapted to any time, any place, any circumstances where people needed to live together peacefully. The children who grew up in those crowded apartment buildings, who learned to navigate complex social relationships before they could read, who understood instinctively how to balance individual needs with community well-being, these children carried those lessons with them wherever they went. They became the merchants who built trade networks across the Mediterranean, the soldiers who held the frontiers, the administrators who governed distant provinces, the craftsmen who created beauty in the midst of chaos. But more importantly, They became the neighbors who made daily life possible for countless other people. They became the kind of adults who could look at a stranger and see a potential friend, who could face a problem and think first about how to solve it together, who could build communities wherever they found themselves. The Roman Empire fell, as all empires do. The buildings crumbled, the roads were forgotten, the laws were replaced. But the lessons of Roman neighborhood life, the understanding that humans are social creatures who need each other to survive and thrive, that communities require constant care and attention, that the art of getting along with neighbors is really the art of being human, these lessons survived. They survived in the medieval villages where people learned to cooperate for mutual protection, in the Renaissance cities where neighbors became business partners and artistic collaborators, in the immigrant communities of the New World, where strangers became family through shared struggle and mutual aid. They survive today in every apartment building, where people choose to greet each other in the hallways, in every neighborhood where residents look out for each other's children, in every community where people come together to solve problems and celebrate successes. The Romans would recognize the essential elements, the careful balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility, the patient work of building trust and maintaining relationships, the understanding that neighbors aren't just people who happen to live nearby, but partners in the ongoing project of creating the kind of world where everyone can thrive. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about those Roman neighbors one last time. Think about Marcus stumbling home from the bakery with flour in his hair and bread under his arm, greeting his neighbors with a tired smile and a joke about his long day. Think about Claudia, managing 3 children in 2 small rooms, somehow finding time to help an elderly neighbor with her shopping, to share soup with a family facing hard times, to mediate a dispute between children who were playing too loudly. Think about the unnamed thousands who never made it into the history books, who left no monuments except the communities they built, who achieved immortality not through great deeds, but through small kindnesses, daily choices, the patient work of making life better for the people around them. Their voices have been silent for centuries, but their example whispers across time. In every moment when we choose to be patient with a difficult neighbor, when we offer help to someone who's struggling, when we work to build the kind of community where everyone can feel at home, we honor their memory and continue their work. The art of getting along with neighbors isn't just a practical skill, it's a form of wisdom, a way of understanding that our individual well-being is inextricably connected to the well-being of those around us, that the quality of our daily lives depends not just on our own efforts, but on our ability to create and maintain the relationships that make everything else possible. In the soft darkness of approaching sleep, let the Roman example remind you that tomorrow will bring new opportunities to practice this ancient art, new chances to greet your neighbors with kindness, to offer help when it's needed, to find common ground in the midst of difference, to build the kind of community where everyone can thrive. The Romans understood that home isn't just a place, it's a feeling, a sense of belonging, a knowledge that you're surrounded by people who care about your well-being, who will celebrate your successes and support you through your struggles, who will remember your name and miss your presence when you're gone. They created that feeling not through grand gestures or dramatic acts of heroism, but through the accumulation of small moments, daily choices, the patient work of treating others with respect and consideration. They built communities that lasted for centuries, not because they were perfect, but because they were human. Because they understood that getting along with neighbors is really about getting along with life itself. As the night deepens and the world grows quiet, rest in the knowledge that you're part of this ongoing story, that every interaction with your neighbors is an opportunity to strengthen the bonds that hold communities together, that every act of kindness creates ripples that extend far beyond what you can see, that the simple choice to be a good neighbor is one of the most important contributions you can make to the world. The Romans would understand. They always did. In their patient wisdom, their quiet heroism, their deep understanding of what it means to be human, they left us a gift that no empire could destroy, no conquest could erase, no passage of time could diminish. They left us the knowledge that we're all in this together, that neighbors are not just people who happen to live nearby, but partners in the beautiful, difficult, essential work of creating the kind of world where everyone can feel at home. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow brings new opportunities to honor their memory, to continue their work, to practice the ancient art of getting along with neighbors. The Romans would be proud. They always were.